Welcome to our next lecture in Sustainable Fashion Strategies, FSS 500. Today I'm recording this lecture from downtown Toronto, from the intersection between King and Yonge Street, located on the traditional territories for many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And it's now home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. This land is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. This land matters to me because it's where I live and work, and I want to respect the indigenous communities who cared for it long before us. It reminds me that my commitment to sustainability is not only about the environment, but also about relationships and responsibility for people. Our topic today is how to conduct research. This class provides you with an introduction to research methods, giving you the foundation to explore topics in depth and generate new knowledge. Developing strong research skills will help you with the following learning objectives. Examine how economic, social, and environmental challenges require rethinking the current fashion business model, and to build a persuasive case for sustainability within an organization. Social sciences are central to fashion research. They help us study human behavior in its cultural and social context. Fields like anthropology, sociology, psychology, and economics give us tools to understand why people consume, produce, and value fashion in certain ways. Anthropology looks closely at human behavior, cultures, and societies. For example, cultural anthropology examines meanings, norms, and values, all of which influences how fashion is created, worn, and shared. Now, what is research? Research is systematic work to build knowledge. In fashion sustainability, it means collecting and analyzing information to increase our understanding of how the industry operates and how it might change. It's essential in sustainable fashion to conduct research because we have so many questions. There are so many things which we need to find out where we don't have an answer yet, that without conducting research, I could have never even taught you any of the lectures I've given you in the last years. And the interesting thing is, if you look on this little piece on the bottom of my slide where you can see a PhD, it's funny when you start working on a PhD and you have all these questions and you want to conduct all this research, and then you think, oh, you're kind of transforming the world. But actually, a PhD will push the needle of knowledge just a tiny little bit out, and that's it. You know, even a PhD which is contributing to knowledge is not so big that you can see it. You're contributing a few more sentences to the field you're working in. So I want to say research is also a lot of work. Every research starts with a research question, something you want to find out. And to some degree, this is in our human nature, and this is how we have developed. Look at this child on the left side. He wants to find out how are coca beans tasting. That is his research question. And then, of course, he will try them. A research question which I asked myself a few years ago was, what are consumers doing with their unwanted garments? This question was really the beginning of my academic career, when I really thought about what are they doing in Canada with them. I really wanted to an answer for this question, and I couldn't find it on Google. I couldn't find it somewhere in the internet. And of course, those are the places where every research kind of starts. We can look Google search, we can check literature reviews, and we can look at empirical studies to find the answer. But there are many questions where there is no answer. And this brings us to research. The purpose of the literature review is to find out what did others write and discover about this topic. And it's really important that you find out what others did before before you start with your own research because you don't want to duplicate the work. So you need to understand the topic, you need to develop your own ideas, and then you will demonstrate the knowledge and acknowledge other researchers. What did they do? So if you look, for example, at our archetypes, I was really pretty determined yesterday to find out how many percentage of each of those types for boys we have on the market. And I did quite some research on finding this out and then finally calculating and estimating the percentages on my own. That's kind of you look what's out there, and then of course we have to acknowledge them. And in our case, for example, McKinsey was one of the people who have done a lot of research in this field. So it's about understanding the topic, developing your own ideas, demonstrate that you have read everything out there about this topic, and then later on when you start with your own work, you need to acknowledge the other researchers. Good literature reviews don't just summarize articles, they connect ideas, they highlight themes, and then they point to missing knowledge. This is how you show you are engaging critically with existing research. Typical comments on those literature reviews are, what does the literature show us? Connect your ideas to the literature review. Summarize the literature on the topic. What is literature? Literature refers to peer-reviewed journals, books, dissertations, and scholarly work. It's a constantly evolving network. Your role is to map it, find gaps, and position your own ideas. And you can see this on the little images on the side. You can see, okay, there is a study, and then of course there is somebody else who has responded, and then there is a major work here, and then somebody else creates a study around that. And by doing this, one work connects with the other, and we create some kind of knowledge network around a particular topic. So here you can see that the literature review is really about understanding the relationship of the publications and how your ideas relate to the body of literature, which means to all the other articles published on this particular topic. You need to find gaps, missing information, or questions that cannot be answered. And I think the literature review is always a pretty intensive, very work-intensive part of a research study, because in a way, you need to demonstrate that you have really read everything out there. And of course, for many topics today, there is already a lot of things published, which can take a long time. It can sometimes takes months until you have really read every article, every paper on this topic. There are different types of literature reviews. While the goal is to turn a network of articles into a coherent literature review, there are differences in the number of articles reviewed and the sources being used. Well, I know, I think you all have done some reviews on literature in the last year or last 2 years, but also you often go on web pages and you check the internet. If we talk about academic studies, you really need to look into academic papers. And to write a lit review, they expect you to write about 30 to 50, to read about 30 to 50 major papers. Sometimes there is also literature reviews that can be selective or so comprehensive and can stand on alone or be part of a more extensive work. So, for example, one time I found an academic paper, and it was only an academic overview of all the literature being published in the topic of textile waste. All the papers in one document, kind of summarized and organized. So it was a whole research only about the literature review. And the idea is to provide guidance, what has been done in the past and what are the next steps, where should researchers actually work on. Let's have a look at an academic article. On the left side, you can see the International Journal of Consumer Studies. That is actually the magazine. Then you can see the title of the article. Here it is fashion interest as a driver for consumer textile waste management, reuse, recycle, or disposal. You can see next the authors and the corresponding author. Next comes the abstract, which is a summary about this entire paper with the key findings. And then comes actually what it's called an introduction. And the introduction is usually a literature review, which introduces the topic of the research field. And here I can show you a standalone review article, and you can see again on the top is the journal, International Journal of Consumer Studies. We can then see the title, Consumers' Clothing Disposal Behavior, a Synthesis of Research Results, and then comes the abstract. And in this paper, the author has really read every article on textile waste out there and summarized it into a comprehensive review article. Literature reviews can take many forms. There are the simple reviews, which provide a basic overview. There are applied reviews, they're used in business or policy settings, and academic reviews, the most comprehensive, requiring deep synthesis and analysis. Depending on your goal, you'll choose one of these approaches. So I'm doing quite a lot of applied research reviews, but of course, for example, over the summer, I was working on a comprehensive literature review about sharing clothes and sharing items. You have probably done quite a few simple ones where you also look at Wikipedia and other web pages where you don't really read that many articles. And of course, you can imagine, you can already see this here on my slide, the academic is the most comprehensive research, and it really requires synthesis and reading a lot of paper. Well, how do I get started writing a literature review? Well, first, you need to choose your topic, and then you start researching and collecting information. You need to figure out how can you keep track of citations and information you have read. So you need to take notes. And then you need to work with your brain, read articles, take notes, shape ideas, and then you start writing on your literature review, and then you go back and then you track. It's an ongoing forward and backward, reading new, trying to find more information, going back, tracking, writing some citations out of the paper which are important for you, and collecting. So it's a collection process and a reading process and then taking notes in between. Now, how to review the literature you find. Collect and read the relevant literature. And I usually start with Google Scholar. I add the keywords and then I will see what's out there. Next, you need to provide an overview of significant literature. You need to highlight key concepts and papers. As you read, you start to describe, summarize, and then make connections by comparing and contrasting. You also need to evaluate, analyze, and organize the information in your reading. Look for relationship between the publications. Identify major themes and concepts, and then identify critical gaps and disagreements. Find the story behind all the information processed. And don't make your review a list of article summaries. So if you look on the right side, you cannot say article 1 said this and this. The author of article 2 did this and this and this. And then the chapter 3. This will not work. So you have to combine them and cross them and bundle the different ideas of the different papers and publications you have read. Writing a literature review is really about integrating and synthesizing your understanding of the literature into something new. So you read one paper, which is the concept A, and this gives you some kind of an introduction to the topic. And then you learn about the concept A. And then in the next paper, you learn about the concept B. And then the next paper, you read about the concept C. And then you need to create your conclusion out of those papers. And you need to come up with your research question. What is not being answered in those 3 papers? What is missing? Where is the gap? When you start writing a literature review, it's really important that you look at the sources of your articles you want to read. The information should really be valid, useful, accurate, and timely. And this is kind of a tricky piece because some papers are 10, 20 years old and they are still the most timely publications on this topic. And then in other fields, you can find a lot of things which have been published in the last year. So timely can mean quite a lot of different things and different time spans. Questions to answer when evaluating your sources is who is the author and what are their credentials? How timely is the information? How credible is the publication? Is the content based on facts or opinion? Are the sources of facts indicated? Is there a reference list? Wikipedia, WordPress, and Pinterest are not credible sources for any scholarly research. But you can go on Google Scholar and check there what is being published. There are different research approaches, inductive versus deductive. Inductive research starts with observations, then comes a process of generalization, and then we develop a theory based on what we have learned. Now, in the deductive research means we start with a theory, a formula, or a hypothesis. Then we collect the data and we analyze it, and then we accept or reject our hypothesis. So it's a different process. There's a difference between research design and research method. The research method is the strategy used to implement that plan. And the research design is a plan to answer your research question or to prove your theory or hypothesis. The research design and methods are different but closely related because good research design ensures that the data you obtain will help you to answer your research questions more effectively. So if you look on the right side, you have your research question, you have your hypothesis, and then the strategy comes next, what is needed to answer the research question, and then finally you plan what you will do to collect and analyze the data. Research methods are a body of rules and procedures that researchers employ in a discipline of study. A set of guidances about conceptualization and execution, a systematic and rigorous intellect inquiry into something that contributes to knowledge. We differentiate between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is all concerned about measuring and sampling. For example, a survey or a statistical analysis provides data in numerical form. So you make an online survey, you have predefined questions, you have multiple choice questions, and then you get the answers, and then you can analyze the results. The qualitative research is more interested in the content and the meaning associated with human behavior. For example, it describes something you experienced when shopping for clothes, the store atmosphere, the sales associate, the merchandise. Or, for example, when you make an online survey and you make an open-end question where you ask the participant, is there something you want to share with the researcher? Or what is your experience? This is when we are starting qualitative data. Both types of research methods make essential contributions, and very often they are actually combined to create meaningful results. A common question is, which research method should I use? Well, the answer is very simple. It depends on your research goal and subject and who you want to study with. So there is not one answer to this question. Now that we have kind of examined the whole literature review, let's have a look at some frequently used research methods. The first one here is observation, participant observation, photo studies, waste audits, object-based research, and other fashion studies methods. The second one are surveys, questionnaires, or interviews. The third one are experiments, case studies, secondary data analysis, archival studies, or there are also mixed methods, which is a combination of different methods. Let's start with observations. Observations require looking or systematic observation and systematic recording or documentation of what has been observed. It depends on the degree of the structure of the research session, such as worksheets, checklists, or other forms of codifying behaviors, such as regular time intervals for observations. They can be made with notes, sketches, photographs, or raw video footage. Participant observation. This includes the researcher participating in the setting or with the people being studied, seeking to document patterns of social interaction and participants' perspectives, to better understand the situation and behaviors in their local context. So sometimes researchers live, for example, in remote communities to better understand and study the people in this area. Or in my example here, the researcher is learning salsa dancing, and while doing the salsa dancing, they are also observing the people around them. Photo studies can be used, and they can invite the participant to photo document aspects of their life and interaction, or as a particular topic. They provide a self-reported visual of user behavior and priorities, and they provide a wide, range of opportunities for interpretations. But it is a method which is common, and I've asked you to make your own first photo study, and yours was based on a review of what you have learned. So, but you could also make it for a new topic which you haven't learned before. One research method could be to take photos. Imagine images of your surrounding when they are feeling a particular way, when they're energized, sad, overwhelmed. We can look at objects of significance. We can look at the interaction with technology during the day, and we can have items with scheduled appointments. When documenting human interactions, caution and respect are necessary for requesting photos of people and their personal details or uncomfortable situations. Photos can only be used in agreement. Ask the people for full name and take notes further at the date to make you sure you can really properly refer to the image. Observing objects is something which is kind of common. Here, for example, I conducted a waste audit, and you can see the people were actually opening every garbage bag which they collected in the garbage truck. And then on the side, we opened those bags, and then we picked out all the clothing, and then we actually split the clothing into clothes, home textiles, accessory, footwear, and other textiles. And then I was further analyzing it. This is a total observation job. Once we had reviewed all those textiles from the garbage, we were analyzing them. We took notes of every item about its condition. We weighed every single item. We figured out what was the composition, how good was its condition, could it be reused? Yeah, and this is why we found out, what is actually in the garbage in terms of clothing. So here you can see what are the textiles that we found in the residential textile waste stream, and then you can see 42% were clothing, 24% Heim textiles, 9% accessories, 11 footwear, 4% was others, 1% soft toys, and then there was about 3% of items which have gone into our bags, but they were not really textiles. For example, one time we actually found a vacuum bag. It's not really a textile, but it was kind of miscellaneous being collected. So here is how we actually then decided on the quality of the items we found in the garbage stream. And we said, okay, items which had a price tag where we can clearly see they have never been used, they will get an A grade. Material which are in excellent condition will get a B. C, you can see signs of wear and tear. D has heavy signs of wear and tear which require repair or remanufacturing. E requires recycle. They cannot be repaired, but they are recyclable. And F grade was material which was so contaminated that even recycling is not possible and they require end-of-life management. And since we analyzed more than 10,000 items, we got a good sense of how is the garbage composed and what are the qualities of the clothes ending up in the bin. And you can see 13% was almost brand new, 4% was in excellent condition. And that's what's going on right now in Ontario with our textiles. This is where they end up. They're not necessarily be donated, they often end up in the garbage bin. Another possibility of observing objects is object-based research. Objects allow the researcher to have a direct sensory experience with the past. Since objects are primary evidence of cultural views, they provide a truthful expression of cultural beliefs of another time. Material culture analysis is a research method that looks at the relationship between objects and how we understand and narrate the past. As Peirce explains, objects help us not only view the past, but also produce our narratives of what happened. In fashion studies, we focus on objects of dress as artifacts. These include clothing, accessories, hats, footwear, and jewelry. But it also goes further. Hairstyles, tattoos, and other forms of body endorsement are part of this material culture. By analyzing these artifacts, we can uncover insights about identity, culture, and social history, all expressed through what people wear and how they adorn their bodies. There are three steps of object-based analysis. The first one is description, the second one is deduction or reflection, and the third one is interpretation or speculation, usually from fashion theory. Now, how can we deduct an artifact or a garment? Well, we need to ask questions. And those questions could be like in-deep reflection. Does the artifact have stylistic, religious, artistic, or iconic references? What is the texture and the weight of the artifact? How would a person wearing this artifact be impacted? For example, would the garment make a noise? Then you can look for personal reflections. What is the reason for examining this artifact? How would it feel on your body? Would you wear this artifact? Is it appealing to you? And then you can create or look for contextual information. Can you find out something about the previous owner? Does the museum, study, or private collection have other similar garments from the same designer or maker? Is the maker of the artifact a well-known artist or a designer? You ask many questions in order to figure out, what do you actually see? What is in front of you? A method which is really very popular are surveys. And it's all about self-reporting information. And this is also a little bit of a tricky piece because you ask people, have you done their homework? And then they say yes or no. But in the end, you don't really know if it's true because it's a self-reported information. And this is the issue with all the surveys. You never know really if they are true. There are some tricks that you can ask a question in multiple ways and that you can add them into the survey so that you can see if people are really taking the survey or if they're just maybe signing up for something. But you can't really guarantee that the self-reported information are correct. So there are two techniques for surveys and for data collection. One is the questionnaire, either self-completed or read to participants and completed by the researcher, or there are structured interviews conducted in person by phone or through various communication technologies. And of course, both of them have advantages and disadvantages. Let's have a look about survey questions. Make sure every question you ask is neutral. Closed force choices structured with limited response options are based on a predefined scale. We often call them a 3 or 5-point Likert scale. If there are 3 possible answers, it's a 3-point Likert scale, and if it's a 5, you have 5 responses. You can also make a 4-point Likert scale, And then you're kind of forcing the audience to make a decision if they're really more towards one point or against something, because there is no middle. Examples here are, which of the following field trip did you enjoy the most? And then you could say visiting the bakery, going to the peak of the mountain, or visiting Canada's Wonderland. Or you can ask, did you like the field trip? And then we have, again, a Likert scale, very satisfied, satisfied, neither satisfied nor satisfied, dissatisfied, and very dissatisfied. Now you can also include open-end questions with no set response to encourage discussion or longer answers. For example, imagine you have superpower. What would you change in your program? Now, it's the fantasy of the respondents what they write. You might think it's easy to create a questionnaire, but it's actually not. All questions must be clear and understood in the same way by all participants. A good survey is when participants are taking the survey twice and they would provide the same answer. You need a sample size which is large enough. So if you want to make a message about Canada, which has about 40 million people, you need a few thousand responses to a survey that you can actually say, okay, we've asked enough people. And you need a representative sample. This means you need to have the same number of women and men as our population actually has. You need to have people from all over the country, from Montreal and Quebec, from British Columbia, from the North, and not only from Ontario. You must include Indigenous people. You really have to make sure that you are kind of representing the entire country with your sample size. Really interesting is when you are actually asking two different groups the same questions. So for example, here in this chart, you can see that I have asked fashion students, and then I asked people from the normal population in Canada what they think about the question. And you can see that there are big differences between the fashion students and the others. So for example, here, I purchase new clothing more often than my colleagues. You can see the fashion students say yes, but people in Ontario on the street, randomly selected, they have a very low part. So I clearly found out that, for example, in Ontario and in Canada, overall fashion interest is relatively low. But of course, if you make such two groups, you can not only just ask the questions, you also need to later on test them and analyze with t-tests, for example, or ANOVA, if the results are really significant or if it was just randomly. Interviews are a fundamental research method for direct contact with participants to collect first-hand personal accounts of experience, options, attitudes, and perceptions. Interviews can be structured and followed a script of questions, such as interviews may be perceived as formal and impersonal, but are easier to control regarding questions, timekeeping, and analysis. And they can be relatively unstructured, allowing for flexible detours in a conversational format. Still, the researcher typically has a guiding set of topics they hope to address in the session. I prefer personally those semi-structured interviews where I have a set of questions when I ask the person. But it's also not easy usually to analyze the results of interviews. And of course, you need to make often multiple people and you need to come up with a good structure how you record the responses. And yeah, in this time here, it was I had the chance to interview Safia Mini, and we had about a 2-hour conversation. I recorded everything, then I transcribed it, and then I analyzed the answers. So it's kind of a lot of work, actually. Here we want to talk about experiments. We want to measure the effect that can an action has on a situation by demonstrating a causal relationship or determination conclusively that one thing is the result of another. This sounds very dramatic, but it's actually really fun. Of course, there must be a presence of two observable and measurable actions or events so that you can actually see this cause and effect occurring before the effect and the emulation of all other possible causes. So the last study I conducted was actually an experiment. I've showed you already the film. We went shopping with people, we bought garments, and they had to share those garments, and then we wanted to see would they really share them? And for example, we wanted to see has it an impact on the quality of the clothing, on the condition of the clothing. We wanted to see how often were they shared and all of that. So that was a typical experiment. You do something and then you want to see what happens. What is the cause? What is the what's occurring? You could conduct a case study. A case study is an in-depth, detailed examination of a particular case or cases with a real-world context, for example, a Canadian designer case study using multiple sources of research evidence. Case studies are helpful in exploratory research for understanding existing phenomena, for comparison, information, or inspiration. But it can also be used to study the effects of change, new programs, or innovations. There can be single cases, are sometimes not enough to support or reject a hypothesis, but you can collect multiple as well. Now, how do you conduct a case study? First, you need to select a case or a small set of cases for a situation or an area of concern. Then you have to study the case in context, in the social and physical setting, and then you need to collect information using multiple methods, interviews, observations, document analysis. For example, I did a case study on Eileen Fisher. I went to New York. I interviewed about 10 people from the company. I visited 2 or 3 of their stores. I analyzed really carefully their upcycling program, their circular economy store, and then I wrote a whole case study about this. I think you have had a case study from Anna, which she used for teaching. And again, you can see there's multiple ways you can make use of such a case study. Yeah, here you can see those are the 12 people I've interviewed, the director of social consciousness, the manager of the Eileen Fisher reuse program, the wholesale marketing manager, the buyer for Eileen Fisher retail stores, a designer for knitwear, a designer for Resoon collection, a facility manager, a sustainability leader, recycle operation manager, and sales associates. And then, of course, I was in headquarters in New York and in Ivington, in the lab, and in the Eileen Fisher store in New York. And another, you can see, you really, I try to get a really good idea about the company, about the people who are working there, and to make it a case, which I then later published actually in a book. Another opportunity is our secondary data analysis, which means you're trying to find something which already exists. So secondary data analysis uses data collected by somebody else, which contrasts with primary data analysis, which involves a researcher conducting a study and collecting your own data. Some examples of sources for secondary data are government statistics, technical reports, literature reviews, online resources. Those are the ones where you take something from somebody else, which you then further use to analyze them. Yeah, and then of course there are finally mixed methods, combinations of methods, and that's very often if you make a comprehensive study. It often has multiple parts and you collect tons of data and then there's a lot of work to actually analyze all this and write it and synthesize it. And I want to say doing research is a job. So, with my last slide, I want to say thank you for listening to this recording, and I hope it was somehow interesting.